Hello. In an important sense, we live in an organised society. Perhaps one of the most important social changes that's happened to human beings over the past 200 years is the rise of large-scale formal organisations. In the pre-industrial period, the vast majority of human beings lived in relatively small units of association. Now, with large corporations, states, governments and so on, the majority of us spend much of our lives suspended within webs of organisation. If you think about the University of Leicester Management Centre and the various organisations and institutions that you spend much of your time and your life within and between. Now, this sort of social change was identified by various writers in the 19th century, primarily looking at the rise of the factory system and of the large urban settlement, the city. If we look at the factory rules example, what we can see there is that in order to ensure that some form of large-scale formal organisation could operate, it was necessary for management, although that term wasn't used a great deal at that time, to start to construct sets of instructions which told people what they were supposed to do at particular times, and set penalties in order that people were punished if they didn't turn up to work on time, told them where they had to work, when they had to work, how much they would get paid, and so on. Now, these sorts of factory rules are really the beginning of what we would now call organisational structure. Organisational structure diagrams, or organograms, are merely two-dimensional ways of diagramming sets of rules, of showing the patterns of authority and responsibility that are supposed to exist within a particular formal organisation. Now, probably the most important person who identified the development of the formal organisation and understood something about the massive impact it was going to have on human life and on patterns of business and work and management was a German sociologist called Max Weber. Max Weber's writing mostly around the turn of the 19th century, and he's writing really about what he calls rationalisation. That's to say, the ways in which an increasingly rational, calculative mentality was becoming important in changing the ways that people thought about themselves and the ways in which they related to other people. He's probably best known within studies of business and management for his writings on what he called bureaucracy. He wasn't the person who originated the term bureaucracy, but very importantly for Weber, he saw the rise of the bureaucratic organisational structure as being, in his terms, a world-changing event, an entirely new way of thinking about how people were to organise themselves, both in terms of their accounts, the accounts of themselves that they would give to other people, but also in terms of the kind of aims that organisations were going to have. Now, Weber, very importantly, suggests that the bureaucratic organisation will be an organisation that has a primarily pyramidal structure. If we look at the example of the organisation chart here, what we can see is a kind of Christmas tree with, at the top, some sort of apex of decision makers, senior managers, supervisors, and so on, moving down through a kind of cascade of middle managers who are delegated various sorts of functions, right the way down to the shop floor or the office in which particular individuals were carrying out particular kinds of tasks. Now, it's really important to note that, referring back to what I was saying earlier, that these sorts of diagrams are basically pictures of rules. Yeah? If we think about the factory rules example, that was a way of writing down the rules. The organisational structure chart, the bureaucracy, is a picture of rules. And these are rules that say things like, this is the person that you report to, these are the kind of jobs that you will be doing, these are the people who are making decisions, and so on. They're all written down, in a sense, in a visual way on the organisation chart itself. Also, very importantly, and this is crucial to the development of modern organisations, one of the things that Weber said about the bureaucratic organisation was that this would, in a sense, produce a slightly different kind of person at work too. He said that the bureaucratic organisation should operate borrowing a phrase from the Roman historian Tacitus, without hatred or passion. That's to say, if you're working within a big bureaucratic organisational structure, you follow the rules of that structure. You don't exercise personal initiative or autonomy. You don't bring your problems from home into work. You treat all the cases, all the people, all the decisions that you have to make according to the rules that have been established within the organisation. This is terribly important. Two clear senses. One is that it allows for a certain kind of impartiality. And the real strength for most authors over the last 100 years or so of bureaucracy has been precisely its almost machine-like character. Yeah, it does what it says it will do, whether that's dealing with some aspect of state functioning, collecting taxes or whatever, or making aeroplanes or cars or producing hamburgers. All of these things are done within the bureaucratic structure in pretty much the same sort of way. Now, another person who was writing about this is Frederick Taylor. Now, Frederick Taylor is a very interesting character in lots of ways. He was an American mechanical engineer, writing roughly the same time as Weber, but as far as we know, that they were relatively unaware of each other's writings at the time. What Taylor does is to describe the organisation, if you like, from the bottom up rather than the top down. So if Weber is concentrating primarily on the organisation chart, on the theory of bureaucracy, what Taylor's doing is looking at the minute tasks, the tiny little jobs that people are conducting within the organisation that patterns the rules that constitute the organisation as a whole. Taylor had a rather obsessive attitude towards work organisations, and in a sense he's one of the first people who wanders around with a white coat on, timing what people are doing, working out how long it takes them to do this or that or the other, and then reconstituting all these tiny little jobs that they've engaged in into a larger picture of what that job was supposed to be like. If we look at the example here, from a very contemporary example from McDonald's, what we have is an example of a bag, no more than that, in which the worker at McDonald's is given instructions telling them exactly how they are supposed to fill the bag. In other words, if you've got one thing, say some burgers and some chips, you put them next to each other. If you've got 2 burgers and 2 chips, you put the burgers on top of each other and the chips next to each other, and so on. Now, this is a really nice example for me of contemporary forms of Taylorism, because essentially what this bag is saying to us is that the makers of the bag are using Taylorist techniques in order to give their workers instructions about the rules which they should be obeying if they're at work within McDonald's. So what we've got then is a kind of a picture of the bureaucratic structure and the Taylorist form of management converging from the beginning of the 20th century, which suggests a very different way in which human beings are going to be organising themselves. From the early 20th century onwards, essentially what happens is that organisational structure and the various rules which constitute that structure become more and more determining of the ways in which people think about their lives. If we consider these kinds of ideas from our current perspective, what we start to be able to see, in a kind of dim way that maybe we're usually not aware of, is the massive importance of theories of organisational structure, of understandings of organisation in general, for the contemporary world of work, for the various ways in which we can conduct ourselves, in which we can solicit various goods and services and so on. Just to close with an example that I'd like you to think about. A supermarket. Now, most of us are very familiar with shopping at large supermarkets. There we have a set of employees who have been given particular instructions about collecting money, about placing particular kinds of products in particular sorts of places, and so on. However, behind that supermarket also lies an even larger and more complicated set of rules. Rules which are about the creation and production of different kinds of products in different kinds of places, about their shipment to certain sorts of warehouses, maybe in other countries, about the timetabling of aeroplanes which are going to move those things around, and so on. A massive network of rules which allows you, in a supermarket, to buy some coffee that was made perhaps thousands of miles away. So in conclusion then, what I've tried to do in this short talk is to give you a very brief insight into some of the ways in which organisational structure has been imagined by people over the last 100 years, and hope to emphasise its enormous importance for any understanding of the way in which organisations operate. Thanks very much.